The church stood at the far edge of Briar Hollow, where the dirt road narrowed into a stretch of wind-bent grass and dying oak trees, its white paint long surrendered to weather and neglect, its narrow steeple rising like a finger toward a sky that had already begun to darken with the threat of rain. And on the evening of October 17th, 1873, when Father Elias Moreau disappeared, the storm arrived early, pressing low over the countryside, as though the heavens themselves had stooped down to listen. There were only 12 parishioners present that night, most of them farmers whose boots carried the scent of soil and livestock into the pews, men and women who had known Father Moreau for nearly 7 years, and who described him always in the same restrained way, quiet, disciplined, patient, a man who spoke softly and listened longer than most, a priest who kept his sermons brief and his confessional hours long. And it was during that final hour of confession, beneath the trembling glow of oil lamps and the steady drumming of rain against the chapel windows, that something occurred inside the wooden confessional box that no one would ever satisfactorily explain. The confessional itself was old even then, crafted from dark walnut, its panels carved with simple crosses and worn smooth where hands had rested over decades of whispered sins, divided by a lattice screen through which penitents spoke without seeing the priest's face, though they often sensed his presence by the faint shift of wood as he leaned closer to hear, or the subtle rasp of breath before he offered absolution. And that night the line for confession had been short, for storms kept most people home. Yet a young widow named Margaret Hale had waited until nearly the end, seated alone in the third pew with her head bowed beneath a black shawl, her husband buried just 6 months prior in the churchyard beyond the hill. And when the final bell rang softly to indicate the closing hour, she rose and approached the confessional while the remaining parishioners gathered their coats and prepared to leave. Some would later say they heard nothing unusual at first, only the usual cadence of murmured speech, her voice trembling faintly, Father Moreau's low responses indistinguishable through the wood. But others insisted that after several minutes the tone shifted, that Margaret's voice grew urgent, almost pleading, though no distinct words carried beyond partition. And then there was a silence so complete it seemed to swallow even the storm outside. One man, Thomas Grady, claimed he heard what sounded like the scraping of wood from within, as though a chair had been abruptly pushed back, followed by a single sharp crack that echoed unnaturally in the hollow space of the chapel. Yet when Margaret emerged moments later, pale and unsteady, she did not scream, she did not collapse, she did not cry out for help. She simply stepped out of the confessional booth and stood facing the altar with an expression so vacant that several witnesses would later describe it as unmoored, as though her thoughts had drifted far from the room. And when Mrs. Pembroke, the eldest member of the parish, asked quietly whether she required assistance, Margaret turned and said only, "He told me to leave," before walking down the aisle and exiting into the rain without retrieving her shawl from the pew. It was then that someone noticed Father Moreau had not stepped out from the side of the confessional. And though it was not unusual for him to remain briefly in prayer after confession, the minutes stretched longer than comfort allowed, and eventually Thomas Grady approached the booth and knocked lightly on the wooden panel, calling the priest's name once, then again, and when no answer came he pushed open the door. What he found had been recorded in 3 separate written testimonies, all of which agree on a single unsettling fact. The confessional was empty. The small wooden chair where Father Moreau customarily sat was slightly turned, as though vacated in haste, his prayer book resting open upon a narrow shelf, spectacles folded neatly beside it, and the oil lamp still burning, its flame steady and undisturbed. Yet there was no priest, no fallen body, no sign of struggle, and no second exit beyond the single door that Thomas himself now blocked. The back wall of the confessional pressed flush against the church's interior structure, solid timber and brick with no passage or window, and the floorboard beneath were intact, unbroken, revealing nothing but dust and age. Several men searched the sanctuary immediately, moving behind the altar, into the sacristy, even into the small storage cellar beneath the chapel. Yet Father Moreau was nowhere to be found, and outside the storm had grown fierce, wind bending the trees nearly horizontal, rain striking the earth so heavily that any trace of footprints beyond the church steps was quickly erased. They searched the fields with lanterns despite the weather, calling his name into darkness that returned only thunder, and by midnight the sheriff from the nearest township had been summoned, arriving soaked and irritated, convinced at first that the priest must have fled for reasons of his own, yet the impossibility of the scene unsettled even him. For no one could explain how a man could vanish from a sealed wooden compartment in the span of seconds without disturbing the lamp, without leaving so much as a scuff mark on the floor. Margaret Hale, meanwhile, was found at her small cottage near the edge of town, seated by her hearth with hands folded in her lap, staring into the dying embers, and when questioned she maintained a calm so profound it unnerved those present, stating only that Father Moreau had listened to her confession, that he had spoken words she could not repeat, and that he had instructed her to leave before the storm worsened, and when asked what those words were, she lowered her gaze and said, "He said it was not meant for me to carry alone," refusing thereafter to elaborate. Suspicion, as it often does, began to coil quietly through Briar Hollow, some whispering that the widow had played a role in the priest's disappearance, others insisting darker forces were at work. Citing the storm as omen, the data as ill-favored, though no evidence supported such claims. And over the following days the search widened to nearby forests, riverbanks, abandoned barns. Yet Father Moreau remained absent as though he had stepped beyond the reach of earthly geography. Weeks passed, then months, and the confessional itself was eventually removed from the sanctuary and placed in storage at the rear of the church, parishioners refusing to kneel within its shadow. Yet those who claimed to pass near it after dusk reported a faint scent of oil, smoke, and damp wood, as though the lamp inside still burned in memory. By winter, the official conclusion recorded by the sheriff was simply missing under unknown circumstances. Though no body was ever recovered, no belongings discovered beyond the spectacles and prayer book left behind, and Margaret Hale departed Briar Hollow the following spring without farewell, her cottage sold quietly to a distant cousin, and in the decades that followed, the story persisted not as legend embellished by superstition, but as a restrained, documented anomaly, preserved in brittle church records and fading testimonies, each line repeating the same immutable fact. Father Elias Moreau entered the confessional at approximately 8:47 in the evening, and by 9 o'clock he was no longer present within the building, though no door had opened, no window broken, and no witness saw him depart. And it is perhaps this absence of spectacle, this lack of visible violence or theatrical horror, that renders the event more enduring than any tale of blood or flame. For what occurred that night did not leave behind chaos but stillness, not destruction but vacancy, as though something had simply removed him from the narrative of the town without explanation, and whether that removal was human, divine, or something unspoken between the two, remains a question that Briar Hollow never resolved. By the second week after Father Elias Moreau's disappearance, Briar Hollow had begun to fracture along quiet lines that no one openly acknowledged, yet everyone felt, for small rural towns survive on shared certainty. The predictability of seasons, the reliability of faith, the assumption that men who enter a room will also leave it, and when that order is disturbed, even in silence, suspicion spreads like frost beneath the surface of ordinary speech. Sunday Mass continued, led awkwardly by A, visiting priests from a neighboring parish of Ashford, but the air inside the chapel had shifted, heavy and uncertain, and more than one parishioner refused to sit within view of the empty space where the confessional had once stood, as though its absence were somehow more accusatory than its presence. Margaret Hale's name circulated in hushed tones after services, though never loudly enough to be considered slander, and yet it was undeniable that she had been the last person to speak with. Father Moreau, the last to hear his voice, the last to close that narrow door between penitent and priest, and Sheriff Daniel Croft, though reluctant to admit it publicly, had begun to consider the possibility that whatever occurred within that wooden compartment had not been accidental nor supernatural, but deliberate, perhaps not violent in the traditional sense, but intentional. He returned to Margaret's cottage twice more before winter settled fully across the fields, each time finding her composed, cooperative, and unwavering in her account, though she offered little beyond what she had already stated, explaining that she had confessed to feelings of anger, doubt, and despair following her husband's death, that she had questioned God aloud in a manner she feared sinful, and that Father Moreau had responded not with reprimand but with intensity she had never before witnessed in him, leaning closer to the lattice screen, lowering his voice so deeply that she could barely distinguish the words, and when pressed by the sheriff to recount exactly what had been said, she hesitated for a long moment before answering. He asked me whether I believed the dead could speak, a statement that Croft recorded without commentary, though he would later admit in private correspondence that it unsettled him more than any other detail. According to Margaret, Father Moreau then spoke a confession not as a cleansing, but as a conduit, suggesting that grief, when carried heavily enough, could open doors unseen, and that the act of speaking certain truths aloud might invite response from beyond the veil of mortal hearing. Yet when she demanded clarity, he abruptly instructed her to leave, telling her the storm would worsen, and that she must not remain in the chapel past the hour. And though she insisted there had been no physical disturbance within the booth, no sound beyond the rain and his own voice, she could not explain the sudden silence that followed her exit. Sheriff Croft examined the confessional again under daylight, dismantling portions of its rear panel to search for hidden compartments or concealed exits. Yet the structure proved solid and unremarkable, built plainly decades prior with no evidence of alteration, and the wall behind it revealed only brick and mortar aged consistently with the rest of the church. Meanwhile, fragments of Father Moreau's personal history began to surface among parishioners who had once considered him almost austere in his privacy. For though he had served Briar Hollow faithfully, few knew details of his years before arriving in the town, and it was discovered through diocesan records that it transferred from a parish in Louisiana following what was described merely as pastoral conflict, a phrase so vague it invited speculation without offering substance. And when Sheriff Croft wrote to that diocese seeking clarification, the response returned weeks later brief and formal, stating only that Father Moreau had requested reassignment due to spiritual strain, and that no disciplinary action had ever been recorded against him. This ambiguity did little to calm the town, and rumors began to weave themselves into narrative threads. Some claimed that Father Moreau had long exhibited peculiar theological interests, dwelling heavily on purgatory and the persistence of souls. Others whispered that he had spent extended hours alone within the church late at night, though such habits were not uncommon among devoted clergy. Yet one detail, small and nearly forgotten, resurfaced when Mrs. Pembroke recalled a conversation from the previous summer in which the priest had remarked upon the weight of unspoken confessions, describing them as stones carried across generations, capable of shaping the living as profoundly as the dead. And though she had dismissed the comment at the time as poetic metaphor, in retrospect it seemed less abstract. As winter deepened, strange incidents, subtle and easily dismissed, began to trouble those who remained closest to the church. The oil lamps within the sanctuary found extinguished in the morning despite being filled the night before, faint impressions appearing in the dust along the rear corridor where no one claimed to have walked, and once, most curiously, the sound of murmured speech reported by the visiting priest while he prepared for Mass alone, a low cadence emanating briefly from the storage room where the dismantled confessional now rested beneath a canvas sheet. These occurrences were never formally recorded, yet they circulated in conversation until even the most skeptical among the parish could not deny the atmosphere had grown oppressive, as though the building itself retained memory. Margaret Hale, for her part, withdrew increasingly from public life, attending services only rarely and avoiding prolonged conversation, though one afternoon she confided in Mrs. Pembroke that she had begun to dream of the confessional, not as it had been but altered, its interior walls stretching impossibly far beyond their wooden frame, Father Moreau's voice echoing from a distance she could not measure, repeating a single question: who bears the sin when it is shared? When asked what this meant, she admitted she did not know, only that the dreams left her waking with a sense of unfinished dialogue, as though her confession had not concluded but merely paused. Sheriff Croft, pragmatic though he was, found himself returning to the chapel alone one evening in late January, lantern in hand, determined to sit within the empty sanctuary and observe whether the atmosphere others described was born of imagination or something less tangible. And though he would never publicly describe what he experienced, his personal journal, discovered years later among his belongings, contains a single entry dated January 28, 1874, reading simply, "The air changes near the storage room. It is not cold, yet it presses. I do not believe in omens, yet I did not stay long." Whether this notation reflects genuine unease or merely the power of suggestion cannot be known, but it marks the first instance in which Croft's skepticism appeared to waver. By early spring, Briar Hollow's attendance at Mass had diminished significantly, several families traveling instead to Ashford despite the greater distance, unwilling to kneel beneath a roof associated now with disappearance and whispered phenomena, and the diocese, concerned about dwindling contributions, announced plans to appoint a permanent replacement priest, Yet none who were approached accepted the assignment after reviewing the circumstances surrounding Father Moreau's absence. Thus the church lingered in a state of administrative limbo. Services sporadic, maintenance neglected, and the confessional, once a symbolic heart of private reconciliation, remained shrouded in storage, avoided by all. It was during this fragile interim that a letter arrived addressed not to the sheriff nor the parish, but to Margaret Hale herself, bearing no return address and postmarked from a town nearly 200 miles south, its contents consisting of a single sheet upon which were written in unmistakably careful script the words, "Confession does not end when the door closes," and though Margaret denied recognizing the handwriting, she could not suppress the tremor in her hands as she folded the paper and placed it into the hearth, watching until flame reduced it to ash. Yet even ash leaves trace, and as spring thawed the fields around Briar Hollow, the questions left behind by Father Moreau's vanishing did not dissipate with the snow, but instead settled deeper into the town's collective conscience. For whether he had fled, been taken, or crossed some boundary unseen within the narrow confines of that wooden booth, one truth remained unchanged. The final confession he heard was never absolved, and the silence that followed had not yet lifted. The letter Margaret burned did not end the matter, for whatever force had unsettled Briar Hollow seemed no longer confined to a single night or a single wooden booth, and by early April Sheriff Daniel Croft had received a reply from Louisiana more detailed than the first, though not officially sanctioned by the diocese, but rather sent privately by a retired clerk who had once served at St. Alphonse Parish, where Father Elias Moreau had been stationed before his transfer north. The clerk's letter, written in a cramped, aging hand, described an incident nearly a decade earlier in which a penitent had collapsed inside the confessional after what witnesses described as an extended and agitated exchange. And though the man recovered physically, he later claimed that Father Moreau had spoken to him not merely as priest, but as intermediary, asserting that certain sins did not rest solely upon the living, but echoed backward into ancestral guilt, and forward into the unborn, a theological interpretation that unsettled parish leadership enough to warrant quiet scrutiny, yet not formal discipline. More troubling still was the account of a brief disappearance. Not Father Moreau, but a parishioner who reportedly left the confessional one evening and failed to return home, only to be discovered wandering days later along the riverbank, disoriented and unable to recall what had transpired during confession, repeating only that he opened something. This phrase appeared twice in the clerk's letter, underlined once as if to emphasize its significance, and though no official record corroborated the event, Croft could not ignore the similarity in language to Margaret Hale's statement that Father Moreau had described confession as a conduit. The notion that such language might reflect metaphor strained credulity less than the possibility that it described something literal. Yet Croft resisted that interpretation, preferring explanations grounded in human psychology. Perhaps Father Moreau possessed a peculiar charisma, an ability to suggest, to influence vulnerable minds through tone and authority, creating experiences that felt supernatural but were born of heightened emotion and grief. Still, the pattern unsettled him enough that he requested access to the dismantled confessional, which remained stored behind the sanctuary under canvas, and with assistance he reassembled it temporarily in the chapel's rear room, intending to examine it not merely for physical anomalies but for structural features overlooked during the initial search. As boards were lifted and joints inspected, no hidden compartments revealed themselves, yet Croft noted something subtle within the lattice screen, faint indentations along the wood, where fingers had pressed repeatedly over time, deeper on the priest's side than the penitent's, suggesting that Father Moreau often leaned forward with unusual intensity during confession, perhaps gripping the screen as he spoke. This detail, minor in isolation, gained weight when paired with testimonies describing the priest's increasingly fervent tone in his final months, sermons that lingered on themes of inherited sin and spiritual transference, as though he believed wrongdoing could migrate from one soul to another through acknowledgement alone. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale's dreams intensified, and she confided reluctantly to Mrs. Pembroke that she now heard Father Moreau's voice not only in sleep but occasionally while awake, faint and indistinct, emerging in moments of quiet like breath against her ear, never accusatory yet insistent. And when urged to describe the words, she admitted that they seemed incomplete, fragments of sentences cut short, always returning to the idea that confession required witness beyond absolution. These episodes might have been dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations had they not coincided with a second occurrence within the chapel itself. For on the night of April 22nd, a visiting priest, Father Callahan, reported that during private prayer he perceived movement within the confessional, though he confirmed it empty moments earlier, the wooden door shifting slightly as if pressed within, and when he approached and opened it, he experienced what he later described in a trembling voice as pressure without presence, an oppressive sensation that forced him to step back. He departed Briar Hollow within the week, declining further assignment. News of this departure spread quickly, reinforcing the growing conviction among townsfolk that the church harbored something unresolved, something not bound by walls. Yet Croft persisted in rational inquiry. Traveling personally to Louisiana in late May to interview those who had known Father Moreau during his earlier service, and there he uncovered an additional detail omitted from written correspondence, that the priest had once been reprimanded privately for conducting confessions that extended hours beyond the scheduled time, emerging pale and exhausted, claiming that certain penitents required deeper mediation, and that one senior clergyman had cautioned him against perceiving himself as conduit rather than confessor. When Croft inquired whether Father Moreau had ever suggested that sins could be absorbed or transferred, the response was hesitant but affirmative, accompanied by a warning that such ideas skirted doctrinal boundaries. Upon returning to Briar Hollow, Croft found the town thinner, quieter, two families having relocated and the chapel attendance reduced to a handful of elderly parishioners. Yet the most striking development awaited him in the form of a new testimony from Margaret Hale, who approached him voluntarily one afternoon with a statement she insisted be recorded formally. She confessed that during her final confession with Father Moreau, she had spoken not only of anger and doubt, but of private resentment toward her late husband, A. Fleeting wish during his illness that his suffering might end quickly even if through death. And though she repented of this thought immediately, she feared it had taken root in ways she could not undo. And when she described this to Father Moreau, he had grown intensely still before asking whether she believed intention alone could alter fate, and whether unspoken desires might manifest consequences beyond conscious control. She insisted that she had denied such belief, yet his subsequent silence unsettled her more than any sermon, and it was after this exchange that he leaned forward and whispered words she could not fully hear. Though she believed, he said, that it must be taken, a phrase she had suppressed in memory until recent nights, when it returned with clarity. Croft, though troubled, refrained from interpreting this as admission of wrongdoing, yet he could not dismiss the possibility that Father Moreau had perceived himself capable of bearing the burdens, confessed to him in a literal sense, that he believed through proximity and ritual he could assume the weight of another's guilt, and if such belief had reached an extreme, what might it have compelled him to attempt within the confines of that wooden booth? As summer approached and Briar Hollow's fields ripened once more, the unresolved absence of Father Moreau ceased to be spoken of openly, yet remained present in every glance cast toward the chapel steeple, and on the anniversary of his disappearance, October 17th, 1874, a small group gathered at dusk within the sanctuary not for mass, but for remembrance, lighting candles along the altar rail in quiet acknowledgment of the man who had vanished without trace. It was during this vigil that the final and most unnerving event of that year occurred, for as the candles burned low and the wind outside stirred fallen leaves against the chapel walls, a sound emerged from the rear room where the confessional had once again been placed. In storage, not a crash nor a cry, but the unmistakable murmur of two voices speaking simultaneously, one low and measured, the other trembling, overlapping in cadence as though confession had resumed behind closed wood. When the door of the storage room was opened moments later, the confessional stood silent and still beneath its canvas, yet the air within the chapel felt altered, charged with a presence that none could name, and in that moment even Sheriff Croft, who had resisted superstition with disciplined resolve, felt the fragile boundary between explanation and acceptance begin to thin, for whatever had begun in Louisiana and followed Father Elias Moreau north had not concluded with his disappearance, but continued quietly within Briar Hollow, awaiting either resolution or repetition. By the autumn of 1874, the question that had lingered unspoken in Briar Hollow hardened into a decision that would later be regarded as either necessary courage or irreversible folly. For Sheriff Daniel Croft, burdened by a year of unresolved absence and fragmentary testimony, resolved that the only remaining course was to reconstruct the final confession as precisely as memory allowed. not out of superstition, but from the pragmatic belief that patterns reveal themselves when reenacted. The proposal met immediate resistance from the dwindling congregation, several insisting that whatever had transpired should be left undisturbed. Yet Croft argued that fear thrives in uncertainty and that clarity, even if unsettling, might restore order. Margaret Hale at first refused participation, stating that she would not again sit within the wooden chamber that haunted her dreams. But as weeks passed and the anniversary of Father Moreau's disappearance approached, she reconsidered, perhaps, driven by the same need for closure that compelled the sheriff. And on the evening of October 17, 1874, exactly 1 year to the hour since the priest's vanishing, a small assembly gathered within the chapel under strict instruction that no one speak beyond what was necessary. The confessional had been reassembled and positioned once more near the altar rail, its walnut panels polished yet scarred by age, the lattice screen intact, the interior chair placed precisely as described in witness. Accounts. Oil lamps burned at measured intervals along the walls, casting elongated shadows that trembled against the ceiling beams as wind pressed against the chapel exterior. Croft himself would occupy the priest's side of confessional, not in imitation of sacramental authority, but as observer, notebook resting in his coat pocket, while Margaret would enter the penitent's side and recount her confession exactly as remembered. The decision was methodical, grounded in procedure, yet none. Present could deny the oppressive weight in the air as Margaret approached the booth, her steps deliberate though visibly strained. She paused at the threshold only briefly before entering and closing the narrow wooden door behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing unnaturally in the hushed sanctuary. Croft entered aside moments later, seating himself upon the same chair Father Moreau had occupied 1 year prior, noting immediately the confined space, the faint scent of aged wood and oil that lingered despite cleaning, and the subtle acoustics that amplified breath while muffling tone. Through the lattice screen he could discern Margaret's outline dimly, head bowed, hands folded, and after prolonged silence she began to speak, her voice steady at first as she recounted her grief, her resentment, the fleeting wish for her husband's suffering to end, repeating each phrase as faithfully as memory permitted. Croft listened without interruption, writing nothing, determined to absorb cadence and pause as variables in the unfolding moment. As she progressed toward the portion of her confession she had previously withheld, the moment Father Moreau had leaned forward and spoken words she could not fully hear, her voice faltered, not from hesitation but from an inexplicable strain, as though resistance met her speech. The lamps within the chapel flickered almost imperceptibly, and though no door opened, a draft seemed to pass through the booth, cooling the air along Croft's neck. Margaret then repeated the priest's question as remembered. "Do you believe the dead can speak?" And in that instant Croft experienced what he would later describe not as fear but as compression, a subtle inward pressure within the narrow walls, as though space itself contracted. Margaret continued, recounting how she denied such belief, how Father Moreau's silence deepened, and finally she whispered the phrase she had only recently recalled with clarity. "Then it must be taken." And as those words crossed the lattice screen, the chapel lamps dimmed simultaneously, not extinguished but reduced to a faint glow, the flame narrowing as though deprived of air. Croft felt his chair shift slightly beneath him, though his hands had not moved, and from somewhere beyond the booth, not outside in the chapel, but seemingly within the wooden structure itself, emerged a second voice layered faintly beneath Margaret's own, echoing her final words with a cadence too measured to be coincidence. Margaret froze mid-sentence, her breathing audible, and Croft, determined to maintain composure, spoke aloud for the first time, instructing her to continue, yet his voice sounded distant even to himself, absorbed by the wood before reaching her. She resumed reluctantly, describing the moment Father Moreau had leaned closer, the sensation that his breath had grown colder rather than warmer, and as she spoke Croft felt the lattice press subtly inward against his fingers, as though another hand mirrored his grip from the unseen side. The compression intensified, not violently but steadily, accompanied by a low murmur that seemed neither wholly external nor internal, and Croft, resisting panic, rose abruptly from the chair and pushed open the confessional door, stepping back into the sanctuary where the remaining witnesses stood rigid in silence. Margaret emerged seconds later, pale but intact, insisting she had heard not one but two breaths within the booth, one hers and one not Croft's, and when they inspected the interior again, they found nothing displaced beyond a faint warmth lingering in the seat Croft had vacated. Yet the most disquieting discovery occurred as Croft retrieved his notebook from his coat pocket, for within it, between two blank pages, appeared an indentation in graphite not of his own making. Words pressed faintly as if written through layered paper, reading, "Witness becomes vessel." Though he had not drawn pencil to page during the reenactment, none present claimed authorship, and though the impression could not be lifted fully without tearing the paper, its outline was clear enough to record. The assembly dispersed thereafter in silence, Margaret escorted home by Mrs. Pembroke, Croft remaining, alone within the chapel long after others departed. Seated in the final pew where Father Moreau once knelt in private prayer, he did not attempt further reenactment, nor did he order confessional dismantled again, for he sensed with unsettling clarity that repetition might invite escalation rather than understanding. In the weeks following the reenactment, reports of murmured voices within the chapel increased, though none as distinct as that evening, and Margaret's dreams ceased entirely, replaced instead by a quiet exhaustion that suggested conclusion rather than continuation. Yet Croft could not dismiss the graphite indentation, nor the pressure he felt within the booth, nor the layered cadence that seemed to accompany Margaret's final words. And though he refused publicly to attribute the phenomena to anything beyond heightened emotion and suggestibility, his private journal entry dated October 18th, 1874, reveals a departure from skepticism, reading, "If confession binds the living to the dead, then perhaps he believed he could sever that binding by taking upon himself. If so, he may have misjudged the cost," and beneath that line, written smaller, almost hesitant, "Or perhaps the cost was intention." The reenactment did not restore order to Briar Hollow as Croft had hoped, yet neither did it produce disappearance and this absence of finality. This incomplete culmination would prove more haunting than any definitive catastrophe, for it suggested that Father Elias Moreau's vanishing was neither accident nor spectacle, but an exchange initiated within a wooden chamber too small to contain its consequence, and that whatever had answered Margaret Hale's confession had not been satisfied by repetition alone. By the time the first snow fell upon St. Bartholomew's Parish, the town had ceased speaking openly of what occurred on that August night, though silence proved no protection against memory, and memory no defense against a sound that returned each evening like a tolling bell, without a tower to hold it, for with the coming of Winter the wind began to move differently through the eaves of the old wooden church, pressing through warped planks and sighing through nail holes in a manner so precise and rhythmic that even the most stubborn skeptics found themselves pausing at dusk, tilting their heads as if listening for a name carried in the air, and some swore, quietly, always quietly, that when the gusts aligned just so, they heard the faint cadence of breath from within the boarded confessional, as though someone inside were leaning close to the lattice, whispering to an unseen penitent. The bishop's order had been clear: seal the confessional, restrict access, forbid rumor, yet human fear does not obey ecclesiastical decree, and within weeks the sanctuary benches stood emptier than they had in decades. Candles burned shorter, offerings grew thin, and Father Thomas Grady, now gaunter and sleepless-eyed, delivered his homilies to a congregation that watched him not as shepherd but as suspect, because it was he who had heard the last confession before Father Matthew Byrne vanished, he who had insisted the door was locked from the inside, he who had described a voice that did not match the priest's tone, and he who now refused to recount the final sentence spoken to the lattice, claiming it was bound by the sacred seal, though more than one parishioner whispered that if the seal protected a secret that devoured a man whole, perhaps it was not God's law, but something older that guarded. And so winter tightened its grip, frost silvered the churchyard, and one night, on the feast of the Epiphany, when candles were meant to herald revelation, Father Grady remained, alone after Mass, kneeling before the altar long after the final hymn died into rafters darkened by smoke, wrestling with a decision that haunted him since August, for he could no longer endure the weight of the unspoken words pressing against his conscience like a second heartbeat, and if silence had preserved order, it had also corroded his faith. For each time he closed his eyes, he heard again the penitent's voice from that last confession, not pleading for forgiveness, but describing, in measured and unhurried cadence, the sensation of standing outside one's own body and observing it from the shadows of chapel nave, as if the soul had discovered a corridor hidden behind prayer and learned to step sideways into it. And when Father Byrne had interrupted to rebuke the blasphemy, the voice had not risen in anger but softened in amusement, asking gently whether the priest had ever considered that confession itself was a doorway, two souls separated by a lattice, yet joined by secrecy, through which something else might listen. Father Grady had dismissed it then as hysteria or heresy, but months of sleepless nights had eroded certainty, and now, with snow hissing against stained glass and oil lamps guttering low, he rose from the altar, retrieved the iron bar that sealed the confessional door, and approached the boarded alcove not as administrator but as witness. The boards groaned when pried loose, nails shrieking against wood, each sound ricocheting through the empty church, like accusation. And when the final plank fell, revealing the small door long kept shut, Father Grady felt not dread but an almost unbearable anticipation, as though a question posed months ago had at last demanded answer, and he placed his hand upon the handle expecting cold, yet found it warm, subtly, unmistakably warm, as if held from within. He hesitated only a moment before turning it, and the door opened without resistance, revealing the narrow priest compartment, unchanged in appearance, kneeler, shelf, crucifix, yet altered in atmosphere, for the air within seemed thicker, not with dust but with presence, and as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the church beyond receded into silence, so complete it felt intentional, as though the building itself were listening. He knelt where Father Byrne had knelt, placed his ear near the lattice, and waited, heart thrumming, breath shallow, and for several minutes nothing occurred save the faint whisper of snow against windows, until gradually, imperceptibly, another sound emerged from the penitent's side, a soft inhalation, then an exhalation, then a murmur so faint it might have been imagination, yet shaped undeniably like words, and Father Grady, trembling, spoke aloud into the dark, "If you seek confession, speak." And the reply came not in haste, but with measured calm, "I seek understanding." And the voice, "O God!" The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but layered, as if spoken by many. Throats in unison softened to a single tone, and it continued. He listened without fear, and Father Grady knew at once it meant Father Byrne, and dread mingled with a terrible clarity. For he understood that the confession had not been about sin but about passage, about thresholds hidden within ritual, and he whispered, "Where is he?" And the answer arrived like a sigh, where listening becomes entering, and the lattice between compartments seemed thinner than what should be, almost translucent in the wavering lamplight, and Father Grady felt the boundary of his body waver, as if the edges of himself were loosening, not torn but gently unstitched, and images flooded him, not visions imposed but memories reframed, of every confession he had ever heard, every whispered guilt absorbed in sacred confidence, each secret held within the narrow space between penitent and priest. And he perceived suddenly that confession was not merely absolution, but exchange, a transfer not a sin, but a burden. And what if, he wondered with dawning horror, something had learned to inhabit that exchange, to feed upon the vulnerability laid bare in the dark? The voice spoke again, closer now, not through ears but within thought. You guard the threshold, yet you do not know what crosses it. And Father Grady tried to rise, but found his limbs unresponsive, not paralyzed but distant, as though command traveled too slowly to reach them. And across the lattice a shadow formed, not cast by lamp, nor shaped by object, but coalescing from absence itself, tall, indistinct, yet bearing the faint outline of clerical robes. And within that outline flickered the impression of face that shifted with each blink, now Burne's features pale and sorrowful, now unrecognizable, now empty, and Father Grady's breath stuttered as understanding sharpened to agony. Father Byrne had not been taken by violence nor fled in despair. He had listened too deeply, leaned too far into the threshold, and something had answered by stepping through. The voice softened, almost tender. He asked to know, it said, and knowing requires surrender. And Father Grady felt the edges of the compartment dissolve, with grains stretching into lines of light, lattice widening into a veil, and beyond it not darkness, but a corridor composed of murmured confessions layered upon one another, thousands of whispered sins forming a path like wind through reeds, and at his far end a faint radiance pulsed, neither holy nor profane but vast, and terror warred with yearning. For if Father Byrne dwelled there, perhaps he could be retrieved, yet the voice cautioned. Retrieval implies separation, and Father Grady realized with clarity that frozen more surely than winter, that there was no separation, that the threshold had never divided priest from penitent, but merely concealed continuity. And if he crossed, he would not return, not a singular self, but as echo among echoes, Outside, snow thickened, blanketing the churchyard, erasing footprints, muffling sound, and inside the confessional the lamplight guttered, casting the shadow into sharper relief until it seemed to extend a hand to the lattice. No, not a hand, but invitation, and Father Grady, tears freezing upon his lashes though no cold touched him, whisper a final prayer not for protection but for comprehension. And as his voice joined the layered murmurs, he felt the boundary give way entirely, sensation dissolving into vast quiet in which every confession ever spoken hummed like distant choir, and in that hum he discerned a familiar cadence, Burns' gentle timbre, interwoven yet distinct, and peace, terrible and profound, washed through him. When dawn came, villagers found the church door unlatched. Snow drifted across the threshold, and within the sanctuary the boards lay scattered. Before the confessional now standing open, empty, and silent, and though they searched the grounds and riverbanks as before, no trace of Father Grady emerged, and the bishop, upon hearing the report, ordered the entire confessional dismantled, its wood burned, its lattice reduced to ash, and St. Bartholomew's Parish shuttered indefinitely. Yet demolition does not erase passage, and years later, when travelers pass the overgrown clearing where the church once stood, some pause without knowing why, tilting their heads as if catching a distant whisper borne upon wind, a murmur too faint for words, yet unmistakably shaped like invitation. And among those who listened longest were clergymen burdened by secrets too heavy to carry alone, for something in the air seemed to promise understanding without judgment, knowledge without return, and if any stepped from the road into the trees, seeking that promise, none were seen again, though on certain winter nights, when snow muffles the earth and silence thickens between heartbeats, those who linger near the clearing swear they hear two voices entwined within the wind, one newly joined, the other older, speaking not in sorrow but in quiet communion, as if beyond the lattice of flesh a corridor still waits, where listening becomes entering, and where confession, once begun, never truly ends.